Hey everyone, this is Craig and Tour, and it's finally time for the painting tutorial for our asphalt base. It's a pretty simple technique. I'm going to walk you through all the steps. Now, we're going to use only a couple of colors for the base. Uniform gray and silver gray. These are just my choices. I used to use a mixture of the darkest gray that Games Workshop had, plus a little bit of their black. It varied between 1 part black, 1 part gray to 2 parts gray, 1 part black, just to get the color gray you want. I found that uniform gray is a great color out of the bottle. And then I'll show you what we're going to do with this later, and then after that there's going to be some washing and glazing to add in extra colors. So first with the uniform gray, I'm going to add a bit of water to thin it down to get good coverage. Now, I primed the base black mostly because any parts I miss when painting the gray, I don't really care about because they're black and they'll be in the recesses, in the deepest parts of the cracks, in the cracks in the middle, so I'm not overly worried about them. I'm just using a large brush so I can get some quick coverage. Generally, it's going to take a couple of coats of thin paint to get really good coverage. I apologize if there's any rumbling in the background. There's a thunderstorm currently leaving my area. Now, because of the way the cracks are and the way I want my shadows, I always take the brush in downward strokes from the top heading down to the bottom. That way, as you can see, I'm not completely covering in the dark or the deepest sections, leaving us some nice shadows to work with. And I'm using a big brush because this is pretty quick, and generally when I'm doing this I've got a number of these bases to go on an army or something like that, so I want to get it done in a reasonable amount of time. This is one of the Army Painter brushes, the Monster one from their range. I like it for big stuff. I wrote a review for them a few years ago for a different site, and I was surprised at how good their brushes were. Just blowing on it to help dry the paint. Now that the paint's going on, you can also see some of the great details in the surface of it, how there's a lot of little irregularities from the way that I smooth it out with my fingers. Now, something I neglected to mention in the construction tutorial was to come back and smooth away any fingerprints. So I've got a couple fingerprints in this because I was doing it quickly and wasn't really checking my work. So just be aware of that. But thankfully, the next step of the process can be used to hide those. Now, I want decent coverage, but it's okay if it's not completely uniform. I could probably stand to do one more coat, but I'm not going to, mainly because it'll allow us a little extra depth in the color as we move on to the next step. And that's actually the last step we're going to do with wet paint. Because when we come back with the silver gray, we're going to use some dry brush techniques. I picked silver gray mainly because it is the brightest khaki color I have. It's an off-white. You don't want pure white. That just won't work nearly as well as you want. And make certain that your surface is completely dry before we move on to the next step. Well, I let this dry, and then I realized that I actually got my steps out of order. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to take some, I'm using Nuln Oil, but any sort of dark wash. I like using a blacker wash, which is why I'm using the Nuln Oil, which used to be Babab Black, which was a fantastic color. And we're going to use kind of a heavy wash. We want it to settle down in any of the cracks, and especially pushing it into the actual big cracks here and any of the deeper places. Same thing happens on the broken side. We want to make certain that it gets into those deepest places, especially if it is a very deep spot. This reinforces all the shadows, and it works towards a really good looking final product. You notice that I'm being a little sloppy with this, which is completely okay because we're working on a natural broken surface. Sometimes I have to do 2 washes if I want it to be really dark, but in this case I want to have a little bit lighter, so I'm going to stick with just 1 wash. Part of what determines how many washes I do is the composition of the miniature I'm going to put on it. If it's a miniature that has lots of deep midtones, then I'll probably make the base darker with a second coat so that it doesn't distract from the miniature. If the miniature is brighter, I'll use just 1 coat because I don't want to darken this too much. But just play around with it and figure out what works best for you. Alright, now we're ready to start with our... Sorry, I lost my train of thought. We're ready to start with our dry brushing. You may notice that the setup is a little different. That thunderstorm I mentioned came in hard and heavy while I was waiting for the wash to dry, so I had to reset a day later. You may notice that we've got a lot more color in here from the wash, especially in the depths where it pooled. It gives you a great look. So I'm going to take my silver gray. It's a very light khaki color. And we're going to dry brush. I'm making the assumption that people know what dry brushing is. You may not, so I'll give you a little explanation as we go along. So I'm going to dip it in, get my brush wet, and then roll the brush around on this piece of kitchen roll to get rid of most of the paint. If you've got old paint spots on there, it's a good way. Another trick is to take it and rub it across your thumbnail, and if it puts on little bits of paint at a time, you know you've got a good amount. So I'm going to start, first things first. Let me refresh this. There are 2 steps to this. The first is we're going to stipple, and then we're going to dry brush traditionally. So I'm going to take the brush and I'm just going to dab it straight on to put down some paint. I'm aiming mostly for the highlights, and you don't want your brush quite as dry as a normal dry brush. When you hit it, you want it to leave a little bit of paint. It's going to look a little crazy. Make certain you hit all the highlights and avoid your deepest areas where the wash is settled. Be a little random with it, move it around. But this stippling is going to go a long way to helping us. You don't want full coverage, something like that's good. Wipe it off. Now we're going to start our traditional dry brush. I start from the edges and pull in because on broken rocks, broken concrete, the edge where it breaks, where it shears off, generally is kind of white and powdery. So I'm going to go around the edge. And then I'm going to drag it in further. You can see the detail starts to explode as the white comes across it. And this is also working with our stippling to give us sections where the concrete is much more bleached by the sun, much lighter. We want to make certain that we turn occasionally and come at it from a different angle. We don't want all of our paint to only come from one angle, because that's going to kill some of the detail. See, as I'm coming in from this angle, I'm picking up spots that were missed the first time. When you come over areas that are really dark from the wash, you don't press down. You want to lightly pull over, so that way your bristles don't get into the deepest section. And at the places where it's highest, you want to make certain you really work over that. You want those areas to be the lightest of all. And you'll notice every now and then the brush will stop putting down much pigment. So reload it. Make certain you roll it off. That way when you come back, you can do it again. Turn it again. I've done 3 different directions on this, and you can really see the detail. But what I want to do is come in and make certain I hit those cracks, make them very bright. I'm making certain that I just touch on the side opposite, pull just over the crack. And you can see it really makes it pop. Same thing for this one here. You want to make certain that when you're doing this, you look to see which edge is higher, and you want to pull over the higher edge. It increases your contrast. And here, this spot here is a lot lighter because it's kind of high, which is good. Just take any place that you want to make it much brighter. Take the dry brush and do little circular motions over it. Reload. And you can see that just with 2 colors in a wash, we have a really beautiful asphalt texture on this base. Great paint work. Now the sides, we want to treat the same way. You want to just pull down. We only want to get the edges that would hit the light coming down at the asphalt. Whoops. This will reinforce the upper edge we worked on, which is absolutely fine. Whenever you're doing this, I would highly recommend you never use a pure white. Pure white is such a bright, excuse me, I keep dropping this. Pure white is such a bright color that it overpowers when you're doing something like this. That's why you want to make certain you use an off-white. Bleached bone is a decent option if you're going for something that's dirty. Deck tan, silver gray. Menoth highlight from P3 is good. And now you can see we've got a very nice looking chunk of broken asphalt. Now, if you want to be quick, you can stop here. I would make certain that after you mount, either before you mount the miniature onto the base or after, depending on what your process is, you want to hit it with matte varnish because the wash makes it shiny. And also, sometimes dry brushing can leave you with a shiny residue depending on the type of paint. But we're going to take this a step further and we're going to do a little bit of washing and glazing to add in some extra color. So now we've got some of our washes. We've got the Nuln Oil, the black wash that we used earlier. Got some blue wash and some green wash. Now, let's start with the blue wash. I'm going to use the blue wash as more of a overall wash. Anywhere that there's a lot of depth or darkness still, I'm going to come back in with the blue. You want to draw the wash down into the dark area. I always check it on my thumbnail to see how much I've got. Here, I'm making certain to follow the crack on the lower side to really reinforce it. And that section there is a little darker, so you can wet your brush and come pick up some of the wash if you don't want it to be that dark. But this just brings some color back into it. Because so far we've really just used gray and white with a little bit of a black wash to darken things. Bringing in the blue adds a little more color and interest to it. It also gives you an opportunity to look and see where the darkness is so you can emphasize it. You can even go all the way to the edge and pull it. Make certain you pull it deep, far away, because you don't want the edge to be dark. Except on the lower edge of your cracks. You want it to be a little darker so that the crack looks much more pronounced. And here in this deep section, I'm just going to load it up with some of the wash. That section there is a little more than I want, so I'm going to wet my brush, pull it away. And you can see the effect that blue has. Now we're going to take some green. Make sure that all the wash is dry. Otherwise, if it's not, it mixes with the previous wash, the new wash mixes, and it doesn't do what you want it to do. Now, unlike our black wash, the early step, you only want to use a very small amount so it dries quickly, but also it ensures that, I'm going to sneeze, excuse me. It also ensures that you don't overpower the color. So the first thing we're going to do, check it, just a little bit of green into the blue. It's going to do two things. It's going to make the surrounding area a different color, and it's going to deepen the blue. Add some complexity. Now, only do this in areas where you want there to be more color. So this crack here, the big crack. And again, make certain you pull the color into the deeper areas. Now, another thing is to dilute your wash ever so slightly, then come in at a high point and just pull it along to add just the tiniest amount of color to it. You don't want to do an overall wash. You want to be very selective. The only reason you'd want to put it in a highlight is if it's a lower highlight, or if you just want to add some color there, if you're going for some sort of visual theme. And also for any of the shallow divots, shallow places, green is a good option because it's lighter than the blue, and it won't make them look quite as deep. And here, because there's so much color on each side, I am going to use a slightly diluted color, get a little color on it, pull it down. There we go. And now you can see we've got a lot more color in it. You can play with any color wash. I like using green and blue if I'm using, if I want it to just look like a street, any old street. But if you're going to have something with a lot of different colors in it on the base, try your reds. Make it look like it's been, something rusty or blood has been seeping into it. Reds, browns, any color. You've got a really good canvas to start with once you put down your white dry brush. Now, one of the last steps is this area along the sides is still very, very stark. You've got your black and you've got your white from the dry brush. Since the side doesn't want to draw too much attention, we can use our black wash again. Try to only get it in the deepest sections. You don't want to overwhelm your brightest highlights. You don't want to put it on nearly as thick as you did on the top. Like here it's thicker than I want it to be, so just dry off your brush a little bit, suck it back up, just like that. Now for this bottom section, since there's such a deep concave area there, I'm going to take a lot more black, push it in, make certain it stays very dark. Same thing right here. There's a big cut right down there, big crevice. And there you go. And that is how you do a broken asphalt base. I hope you've learned something from this. If you enjoyed this and learned something, then please feel free to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, or send me a comment over at Stone Tower Reviews. Mark. I hope you didn't think that was it. I'm not going to leave you guys hanging. We're going to finish this asphalt base with a paint line for the street. Now, to do this, I'm outside because you're going to be spraying. You're going to need 3 things because we're going to do salt masking. You need some hairspray, you need some salt, and you need a color. I'm just using white primer for this since I'm just going with a white line. So for the salt masking, first we're going to spray on the hairspray to make this tacky so that our salt can adhere to it. This is all I have at home right now, a sea salt grinder. Table salt works. The reason you want to use salt instead of other things is because of the cleanup step where we're going to put this under running water. The salt will absorb the water and wash away easier than other substances. So, first things first. Give it a good coat and then come in with your salt. Now with the salt, you don't want to overdo it. If you overdo it, it'll make the line look pretty bad. You just want a light sprinkling over it. It's kind of difficult to see, but I've got a decent amount of coverage there. Next thing we've got to do is wait for this to dry before we can put the paint on. That takes a couple of minutes depending on the hairspray. Blowing on it will help, anything like that. So we're going to come back when it is dry. Alright, we're back and the hairspray has dried completely. Now, you can see here, I have just a small crack showing. If you have large cracks where you can actually see a lot of the texture between the pieces of asphalt, you're going to want to put something in there. Otherwise, it's going to look strange when you spray on your color. I would use something like poster tack, blue tack, anything like that will work. So we've got the salt masking on. Now we're just going to take our color. Common colors for roads are white and yellow road lines. If you're doing something different, handicap markings, things like that, then just use a picture reference of something in real life and try that. So let's spray this on. Alright. This is going to give us good coverage. And I completely neglected to tell you before I started this, I'm sorry, that the first thing you need to do before you do any of this is seal the base with varnish. I used matte varnish over it. I really am sorry that I didn't say that before I started this step. The reason you do that is because we're going to wash this with water to get rid of the salt. And that's going to let us see through to the street below underneath the line, giving us a great realistic worn effect on it. If you don't seal the base first, then your wash will probably be diluted some and wiped away. And overall it just protects the base work that you've done so far. So now you let this dry the same way you'd let any primed layer dry or whatever type of paint you use. Alright. Everything's dry and we are ready to proceed with the last step. I'm here at my sink and I'm going to turn on some warm water. You don't want it to be too fast or too hard of a flow. You just want to gently wipe away with your fingers the salt that you put on earlier. You can see that it's cracking pretty well. And also you want to let the water dampen the adhesive from the tape so that you can take it off. That way it's separating much easier than it would if you would try to pull it off with your fingers while it's still dry. I'm having some trouble doing this one-handed because I'm holding the camera with the other hand. So I'm going to turn off the camera and get the tape off. And then I'll show you the finished product. Well, I got the tape off, and you can see we have a finished asphalt base with a nice road stripe going down it. The salt masking does a job of breaking up the line. This is honestly a little too uniform for my taste. I wish I had gotten a little more along the edge so it wasn't quite so clean, but other than that, for the most part, it looks quite good. And this is how you can make a really good asphalt base. I hope you guys have enjoyed this and learned something from it.